Mobile phone notice. I would just like to remind members to ensure that their mobile phones are switched off. This is important as it causes interference for our broadcasting, editorial and sound staff. Today we have engagement on alliance building to strengthen the European Union. I'm very glad that Ms Catherine Day is here today to discuss alliance building to strengthen the European Union. Ms Day is well known to all of us as the former most senior European civil servant and currently serves in a number of roles, including as a special advisor to President Juncker. It is important that the EU is prepared for the future, and a future without the UK in it. We must look ahead and think about how strong relationships can be built between EU states and how Ireland can best contribute to that. And of course, alliances can go beyond governments working together. This is something that many of us can work together in different spheres. Before I begin, I have to remind everyone on the rules on privilege. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official either by name or in such a way as to make them identifiable. By virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. If you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter to only a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise nor make charges against any persons or identity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Ms Day, I might now ask you to make your opening statements, and I'm sure that our committee members will have questions and comments for you. And again, it's a real honour to have you here. As I said to you already, your CV precedes you, and you're known for your extremely strong work ethic, something that I really admire in everybody. So it's a privilege to be chairing a meeting that you're coming to today. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman and members of the committee, and thank you for inviting me to address you today on the topic of alliance building. This has always been an important part of how the EU works, and I think it takes on a particular relevance in the context of Brexit. And so I'd like to start by commending you, Chairman, and the committee for your very timely initiative in considering this important topic. I think we all know that the EU will be very different after Brexit, and I just want to mention a few of those areas because I think that's the background to the focus on alliance building. First of all, obviously, inevitably, the EU will be more continental in outlook after the UK leaves. And among other things, this means that the civil law tradition, which is the basis of most continental lawmaking, will be more dominant than when the UK, with its common law tradition, played a big role. Secondly, France and Germany will obviously be playing a bigger role in shaping the future direction of the EU. They will no longer have to contend with the questioning and the reluctant attitude of the UK. And in thinking about today, it struck me that the EU was already functioning before the UK and we joined, but we, Ireland, have never known the EU without the UK, so it's going to be quite a change for us. And we often saw issues in a similar way to the UK, and we will certainly miss the role they played as a big member state in being a buffer between France and Germany and in terms of organising a different debate. I think more than ever in the future, the euro will be the core of the EU system, and further consolidation and deepening can certainly be expected. Without the opposition of the UK, and this may be one of the positive sides of UK departure, I think the EU will develop stronger social policies. This will certainly be needed to address the challenge of populism and the feeling among parts of the EU population that they somehow have missed out on the benefits of globalisation, that they've been left behind by open trade. And the EU does need to be able to show that it cares about all its citizens and that stronger economic policies will be accompanied by social policies that deliver. I do have a couple of worries about how the EU will be in the future. I am concerned that the EU 27 could be more protectionist than we are at present and perhaps a bit less open to the outside world. And in my view, the current push to curb the competition rules and develop European champions is not a healthy development. I also have a worry that what's called in Brussels the better regulation agenda, which has, I think, improved EU policy making through evidence-based, impact-assessed policy proposals resulting from wide stakeholder consultation, that process will be given less importance without the constant pressure of the UK to combat red tape. So these are just a few of the changes that I think we can expect to see in the future. And for me, that means that the post-Brexit climate will require a different approach to Irish membership in the future. I think we've all seen during the Brexit negotiations just how deeply integrated we are as a union, how much we benefit from things that we take for granted. We take for granted, but they only exist because of our EU membership. And perhaps most of all, I think we've seen a need to keep our citizens involved and to help them feel that the EU actually belongs to them and it's not something imposed from the outside. So there are 4 areas I'd like to focus on in just my brief opening remarks. First of all, I'd like to say something about the need for much deeper understanding of the wishes and the problems of other member states so that we, Ireland, can build alliances with like-minded countries, but also so that we understand the opinions and the positions of those who will differ from us. Secondly, I want to talk about the advanced need to anticipate what proposals are likely to come from the institutions and from other member states and to seek to influence them at an early stage. Then thirdly, I want to say a few words about the need for earlier work with others on the proposals that we want or that we don't want to see agreed. And then finally, to finish with talking a little bit about the need for continuous information to our citizens on how and why the EU is changing and Ireland's place and role within that future union. So first of all, on the topic of the deeper understanding of the views of others, I think there's a need for a systematic approach. The EU is now so big through successive enlargements that it is really impossible to keep up to speed with thinking in every member state unless you have an active information gathering and information exchange system in place. New technologies have made it much easier for us to keep in touch with people around the world, but we can keep in touch with them directly. But then do we know whether they represent a considered national or sectoral position, or are they just transmitting their own personal views to us? So there's plus and minus with the ease of contact. And I think everybody knows that in Ireland we attach importance to personal contacts, but so do our EU counterparts. And building relations over time based on a deeper understanding of their point of view is crucial to building good alliances. In my time as Secretary-General, I noticed a strong tendency to form groups of what's called like-minded member states. And there are some very long-established such groups. If you think of the Francophonie of the French-speaking countries, the organisation of the Benelux countries, as well as newer ones like the Visegrad countries in Eastern Europe and what people are calling the New Hansa League. But I think it's important that we don't only talk to those who are like-minded, but that we also reach out to those who hold different views from us, because the EU is all about finding workable compromises that allow it to move forward in the interest of all its members. So reaching out to those with different views is just as important and crucial a part of the engagement as it is talking to those who would agree with us. I think we're all very conscious of the huge solidarity that Ireland has had from the other EU countries and the EU institutions throughout the Brexit process. In my view, this has been achieved by the mobilisation of politicians and diplomats with our other partners, with a clear message from Ireland, with a clear investment in time and travelling to meet partners who in turn have been willing to take a serious interest in the case that we put. And I think we're going to need to keep up that kind of effort in future. We have to reach out beyond the English-speaking world to our continental partners, and that means travelling to them, and it means keeping in touch on a regular basis, not just when we have a problem, obviously. I think this will mean a requirement for more staff increases, not only in the Department of Foreign Affairs, but across all departments that are dealing with EU matters. It will also require a bigger travel budget, so that politicians and officials can regularly visit different countries as part of building deeper alliances. And thinking about this, it came to me that, in fact, what we need is something close to the mobilisation that Ireland engages in every time we have a presidency of the EU. Then we really gear up. We have similar messages across all messengers, and Ireland has a very good track record of successful presidencies. I think the good news is that all of the smaller member states are coming to the same conclusion. They all see what we see, the need to work together permanently to ensure that the voice of the smaller member states is heard. And this is certainly a task for government, but not only for government. I think the Oireachtas can do very useful work with other national parliaments and social partners and civil society, all of whom have a role to play in building long-term alliances. Now, I want to mention two organisations that I know of, which I believe can play an incredibly useful role in supporting this process. I'm on the board of both of them because I regard that membership as being a pro bono part of my continuation of public service. And I'm talking about European Movement Ireland and the Institute for International and European Affairs. I think both organisations are well known to this committee. But with their connections in other member states and in their different roles, both can play a huge part in helping to inform Ireland about changing EU priorities and help formulate wise national responses. But the point I'd like to raise here is that both of those organisations have to spend a lot of time and resources on fundraising every year. And they're very grateful for the public funding that they get. But I think it would be important to find ways to support them that allows them to devote themselves to the challenges of the task that lie ahead, instead of just being engaged in a constant quest for project funding. So I hope maybe that's something the committee could have a think about. Also, having worked most of my working life in the European Commission, I want to say that alliance building shouldn't only be confined to other countries, other member states, but that I see a similar need to invest in the European institutions. We've all seen the role that the Commission has played over the last 2 years in standing shoulder to shoulder with Ireland through the Brexit negotiations. And in general, the Commission sees itself, and I think should be seen, as a true friend of the smaller member states. But my generation of Irish EU staff is retiring, and our numbers are going down. And I think that we need to encourage young people to think about a career in the European institutions, and maybe also to take more active measures to support them when they make that choice. Without in any way interfering with the independence of Irish EU staff, they can be a very important source of information and guidance on what is happening across the institutions. My second point is about anticipating what's going to be coming down the track from Brussels and elsewhere. I think there will be less legislation in the future because the EU has a well-developed body of legislation in many, many areas. And what's needed now is to keep it relevant and up to date, not necessarily to add to it. But of course, all the time there are new challenges where coordinated action at EU level will be more effective than uncoordinated national action. And so, in response to this change of need, the Commission has been developing an overall set of policy proposals for each of its 5-year mandates. And this year, 2019, is going to be an absolutely crucial year in that respect. You certainly are following closely and feeding into the meeting that the heads of state and government will have in Romania on the 9th of May to talk about the future direction of EU27. But just following the European Parliament elections, most likely in June, the new President of the European Commission will be nominated. And the European Parliament will then vote in July on confirmation of that President on the basis of what he or she sets out as their priorities. And the Parliament will certainly seek, through its system and its committees, to influence that programme of work. And then when the Parliament holds hearings of the nominated commissioners, they will also be seeking to feed into the future work programme of the Commission for the next 5 years. And similarly, in the Council, ministers will also be wanting to feed into that programme. So this is really a crucial year of influencing and deciding the future direction of EU policy. Now, it won't be set in stone. Of course, the next 5 years will bring new crises, need to adapt, etc. But the backbone of the EU agenda for the next 5 years is going to be set before the end of this year. So I really hope that civil servants and stakeholders are getting ready to feed in their ideas and to react to those that are going to be advocated by their counterparts in other member states. And that leads me to my third point, which is about influencing future proposals. Because the Commission nowadays spends a lot of time in consulting and involving stakeholders long before it makes proposals. But unfortunately, many stakeholders, and this can sometimes include member states as well, they don't get involved early enough in the process, and then they have to scramble at the last minute to try to develop their positions and to have them taken into account. And in my view, I think we in Ireland would benefit from early discussion of upcoming proposals, not just across government, but also across stakeholders. I think this would give a lot of opportunities to feed a really mature and well-developed Irish perspective into the work that we would do with opposite numbers in other member states to develop like-minded positions. Because I think if government and stakeholders can work together, at least on the key proposals, then there will also be a wider effect of wider public understanding of how the EU is working and how Ireland can have a role to shape and influence it. And that brings me to my fourth point, which is about the need for continuous citizen involvement. I think I'm well placed to know just how badly the EU has suffered from a bad press as a remote and soulless technocracy. And in particular, the British Eurosceptic press has had a lot to do with that. They have used ridicule to really try to undermine what is very solid and praiseworthy progress in a lot of areas. And I think here in Ireland, we've seen a very strong desire expressed through our many referendum campaigns, but also in other ways, by people to want to understand and to be part of what's happening in the EU. We've also seen now with Brexit what can happen when people feel alienated from that process. So while we may be enjoying at the moment a kind of Brexit dividend in terms of Irish support for the EU, I think we all know that it's very hard to maintain that intensity of interest and that level of focus in more normal times. So I think we need to think about how can we have a kind of step change in how information circulates on the EU and on creating a greater sense of civil involvement. And I think it is possible to make a complex technical organisation like the EU accessible to citizens if we take the time and invest the necessary resources. Because we have examples like the Citizens' Assembly, the All-Ireland Civic Dialogue on Brexit, and the government's Future of Europe Citizens Dialogue national engagement process. Each of those different activities show what can be done. And I think what we need is some kind of permanent programme of citizen involvement, not just on issues, but on an ongoing basis. I've already mentioned European Movement Ireland and the IIEA, and I think they have important roles to play. But I think more frequent debates in the Oireachtas on EU policies would also be helpful, and there are examples in other member states that are worth examining. And I wonder whether this committee might like to consider whether there could be more regular reporting on the floor of the Dáil about at least significant EU meetings and issues as they develop. Because I think we need to find ways to stimulate a real debate in the media, away from the kind of polarisation and politicisation that has really too often been how EU differences of opinion are portrayed. So I think the first step would be to agree that we need a deeper and more inclusive debate, and then I'm sure there'll be a lot of good ideas about how to make it happen. I don't think it's necessarily there's necessarily a need to develop a new body to do it, but rather to use the existing structures that we have and to inject a deeper EU dimension into many of the ongoing processes that we already have. So, Chairman, without wanting to be too long, let me just conclude that we all know that the EU post-Brexit is going to be different. The question is how to prepare to get the best out of the next stage of our own membership of the EU, and alliance building is clearly going to be a very important component of that. There are member states that we have a lot in common with, and it will be easy to I think, team up with them. But there are also those who have very different views from ours. I think we have a natural advantage because we're not in any one geographic or political grouping, so we can move between different groups depending on our interests. I think I've explained also why I think we need to have a concept of alliance building that includes alliance building at home and not just with other countries and with the other institutions. And finally, I think the most important alliance of all has to be with our own citizens, because they need to feel that they are involved and that their voice is heard. And we've seen through the different referendum campaigns that we need a more sustained level of communication and information to keep up the high level of support for the EU in this country. So, Chairman, let me stop there, thanking you again for this opportunity. I want to wish you success in your deliberations. I look forward to seeing the results, and if I can be of any help now or in the future, please don't hesitate to involve me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Day. Thanks for that very comprehensive overview. Could I first of all go to Senator Neil Richmond, please?
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you very much, Ms. Day, for that very comprehensive presentation. I don't want this to go into an echo chamber, so I'm therefore not going to say, yes, I agree with everything, brilliant, and leave it at that. But I do agree with pretty much everything. So I had a couple of points and then a couple of questions, if that was okay, based on your remarks. The first is one area where I think is very much lacking is the level, as you discussed, about parliamentary engagement, inter-parliamentary engagement. Most of us are very lucky every 6 months to travel to the COSAC meetings, but outside of that arena, I think there is a limited amount of engagement for domestic MPs and senators as opposed to our MEPs. And when you look at the introduction of direct elections and the abolition of the dual mandate in our European Parliament, we have our MEPs very much being members of the European Parliament, which is great, but we don't necessarily have national domestic parliamentarians engaging with counterparts on a European level. And I'm talking on a sectoral basis, so rather than just having COSAC every 6 months, why isn't there shadowing the European Council meetings, an agricultural version, a finance version, a justice version, to bring all those committees together? I was very fortunate to spend just over 2 years on the Committee of the Regions, and one of the best things about that is you were dealing with domestic politicians and looking at the comparisons between what works. It was really subsidiarity in action, trying to take European policies to the member state. And tied to that, I absolutely agree with the need for the increased presence of our diplomats across Europe, particularly within our Perm Rep in Brussels. I think one of the real shames was reducing the numbers after the 2013 presidency and then having to build it back up. Now, it stood to us, we've so many excellent people there, and that has been seen over the last 2.5 years. But I think we really need to expand our key embassies. It was a great achievement during the crisis years to keep all the embassies open, at least. But I think we need to increase the staff members, increase the amount of people from our state agencies, Enterprise Ireland, Board BIA. But also I think there is a need for additional consular outreach. So not just the embassies, but existing consuls like we see in the UK with the consulate in Edinburgh, the newly reopened consulate in Cardiff, and the planned consul for Northern England in the next 12 months. I know there's one coming on stream in Germany, there's talk of reopening in southern France, but I think there's a huge scope for that across the EU, particularly when we look at cities that are probably more comparable in size with Irish cities and the efforts they're going to. One of the key things, and it relates to when you mentioned about your generation of Irish European officials in terms of that we are losing so many good people, and I don't know if they're being replaced. And I know they aren't being replaced, quite simply, and there's going to be a huge gap there. And look, one of the reasons I left Brussels in 2007 was Dublin was a lot more attractive place to come back to than maybe it was 25 years ago. But I think one thing is that puts a lot of people off is the onerous the scare of the Concours and the scare of admission into the institutions itself. And you see a lot of people working in the private sector in Brussels or in agency-related work unwilling to go into the Commission. And it's not money that's turning them off, it's not conditions, it's the linguistic. And a lot of emphasis was rightly put on the status of the Irish language and all that, but I fear post-Brexit the amount of people within the institutions with a command of English as a first language, and we see English now increasingly as the working language of the EU, whereas previously it was French. Can anything be done in terms of a derogation or anything else to prioritise native English speakers within a European context, possibly to give them exemptions, be it within the Concours or preferential status, because there's only so many Maltese and Irish citizens around, and we are going to have to replace. And if we look at the amount of British European officials for the last 15, 20 years, so many of them were on secondment from government departments as opposed to coming through the direct admission system. And I think maybe there needs to be a level of flexibility that possibly hasn't been there before. And in terms of citizens' engagement, there's two aspects there that I think is critically important. The European Commission is brilliant at informing people about how they can complain about the EU. And unfortunately, it allows so many, as you rightly say, of the myths to go through, particularly in the tabloid media. If you have to read one more article about blue passports and straight bananas, we'll all go a bit mad. But it does resonate. So perhaps we need to be a little bit more abrasive and counter the myths. And maybe the European Commission, or perhaps, to be honest, really domestic politicians, need to be a bit more direct in championing all the very good that Europe has done over the last 60+ years. Not just talk about mobile phone roaming, the really deep things that my generation take for granted. And we can go all the way back to peace if we want. But I just think the European Commission and the European institutions as a whole could be a lot more aggressive, to be honest, in selling the narrative and taking on the absolute ridiculousness that's presented. And I suppose in engagement, one of the big things that has come is, it's a concept that is alien to this country, but perhaps not to others, is that of the Spitzencandidate. And it worked well for the last European elections, and obviously I'm happily contributing to the campaign of Manfred Weber for these European elections, but it's not a system that we in Ireland, who don't use the list system, necessarily appreciate. So I was wondering, I'm sure it will require a direct treaty change and all that, but potentially directly electing the Commission President, with confines, guaranteeing that they're to be nominated by a political group or a mass number of European citizens, but for people to actually have to go into the ballot box and put a number 1 or an X beside their chosen candidate, rather than it being indirect. We don't have the list system in this country. No one knows that Manfred Weber is the top of the Fine Gael list on May 24th. But perhaps if they actually got, okay, it wouldn't be 2 ballot papers, probably half a dozen ballot papers, given every other election that happens at that time and referendum and everything else, but to say that we need to familiarise ourselves, and it might also force political groups to narrow it down to one candidate, a challenge I put to other colleagues. But those are a few ideas, suggestions that I'd love to get your opinion on, but I had some more specific questions in relation to the nature of alliances and the real, and you touched on some of them, but I was wondering how best can we approach these natural alliances. You know, is it the sectoral manner that we know that Ireland and France have always worked hand in glove when it comes to agricultural policy and the CAP? Is it the ideological approach when it comes to monetary policy, now that Ireland sees itself far more as Northern European, and you talked about the new Hanseatic League, or is it just the geographic? Are we looking at, you know, the UK was our closest neighbour, so it was an obvious one beyond policy to link up with, but they're not going to be there. So it really does fall on us to increase our engagement with the Benelux countries and possibly some of the others who are just simply closer to home. And the final one, as you mentioned at length, is the smaller member states. How can we prioritise what policy that we can identify with? Because the policies of Luxembourg differ drastically to those of Estonia. But what are they, just any smaller state? You know, or which smaller states should we identify and in which areas? And I don't think we need to be rigid that just because we're an ally with one country on one issue doesn't mean we can't be an ally with another country on another issue. But I suppose the most important alliance, I believe, and it's a political alliance as much as anything else, is the alliance against Euroscepticism. And how best can we come together and really take on the populists of the hard left, the populists of the hard right, some of which are in government now. That is the biggest challenge. The challenge and the most important alliance is bring together the countries, be they part of the European movement for over 60 years or just since 2013, and to say, well, we want this process, this peace process, this movement to go on for over 60 years. How do we build that alliance? How do we solidify that alliance? Unfortunately, for too long, we probably took that alliance for granted. And I say this against domestic politicians. It was too easy for too long to blame Brussels. We need to take responsibility for our own actions. We need to triumph when initiatives and ideas come from a European level. We need to give that the level of support and credit it deserves, but equally we can't simply use the foreign bogeyman, the perceived foreign bogeyman, as somehow responsible for all our ills. So that's an alliance I believe is, of all alliances, the most important to build up, and I really welcome your opinions on that. Thank you
very much, Senator. Deputy Bernard Durkan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I welcome Captain Day to our meeting, like you did yourself and others, Chairman. And I have no doubt that the role that she continues to play will bear good fruit in the future, as it has in the past. I happened to be at a meeting in Bucharest for the last 2 days in which the same subject matter was up for debate. In the first instance, and this comes up again and again, I'm a long time attending meetings in Europe now, almost 40 years actually, when I think of it. And the situation is this. It has the same questions come around again and again and again, bringing Europe closer to the people. I think the phrase is wrong. It should be the other way around, along the lines that Senator Richmond has been talking about. I think we, the people, and the representatives of the people, need to familiarise ourselves more with what affects our colleagues in other countries throughout Europe. And what Britain did, unfortunately, was it stood aloof from Europe. In the days of Henry Plum, for example, it was different. But since then, the critique has gone on without cessation. And it was constant criticism, constant dripping wears a stone, and it did. But don't forget, let's not forget, that Nigel Lafarge and people like that were elected for that purpose and became the lightning rod for debate in that area, to the extent that they dominated the debate whenever that debate took place, which was regularly. We had presentations of that nature at the Future of Europe meeting that I attended in the last couple of days. Extremes of both, right and left. And I was reminded of a similar meeting I was at in Berlin a few years ago, when the phrase was on the order paper, "Where is social Europe?" This was at the very beginning of the crash, the economic crash. And nobody seemed to understand that when times went really, really bad, other distractions arose, and the leaders across Europe had to attend to the issues that were of the most serious domestic importance at home, and they did, and largely with beneficial effect. Again, and sadly, Britain took the opportunity of criticising at that particular time. And much of the media in the UK was dedicated towards constant critique of where Europe was and how it was going to fail. We seem to have forgotten, in the last couple of years, how the prediction was that the euro was about to fail. It was going to disintegrate. And the reasons for it, according to themselves, coming largely from the media, not all tabloid either, in the UK. And the criticism I'm sure that we all did at various meetings, had to listen to a tirade of how poor we were and how much poorer we were going to get, and it was all as a result of being members of the European Union. So I believe that we need to take ownership. Well, we have done better than most other countries, but every country member of the European Union needs to take its ownership of the Union. If they don't do that, they're moving apart, and they will move apart, and populism will win out. And it is hugely important that the elected public representatives right across Europe, domestic politics, and at the European Parliament, that they take on the critics, that they take on those offering the easy options. Don't let's forget, Mr. Chairman, that this is not the first time that populism invaded Europe. This is not the first time by a long, long shot. And those who say, that can never happen again, that's wrong. These things have happened again. Man's inhumanity to man knows no bounds when it comes to repetition. So we need to be conscious of that fact, and also conscious of the fact that we can do something about it. So my feeling is there, and again from the discussions over the past couple of days, is that we need to be alert, we need to speak, we need to without doing it aggressively, we need to dissect the arguments put forward by people pursuing a populist stance and prove to them by reason that they are wrong and the extremes on both sides are wrong. The alliances, I think, are hugely important. I think that's the way to do it, but I think that's part of a natural progression of getting to know the other people more. And I entirely agree with Senator Richmond in relation to the national domestic politicians need to get to know each other right across, because how else do all of us here understand the issues that affect other people? There are deep worrying issues affecting every country in the European Union, as they do all over the world, in every country all over the world, and it's up to ourselves to be familiar with them and to be sympathetic towards them. And if we do not find ourselves in agreement with them, that at least we understand them and that we can do something about it in that way. I hope that we don't have, and there was a few hints at it in the last few days, I hope we don't disintegrate towards a world trade war. There is a danger, I believe, that we can descend into a sort of a tit-for-tat situation where, and we had to explain yesterday to some people that, you know, trade agreements are not the gift of one group or one country or one philosophy. They are reached by agreement. The late Peter Sutherland spent a huge amount of time negotiating the GATT agreement many years ago. But there seems to be a feeling now developing that the most powerful should dictate the pace, and that by so doing they will achieve an agreement that they will achieve a situation that they couldn't achieve by agreement, by natural discussion and dialogue. And I think that's a worrying factor. That's particularly worrying for smaller countries. I think that in the aggression that takes place in trade wars, the smaller countries get damaged first and hit the hardest. And the protagonists, unfortunately, damage each other to the extent that the fallout is the same again insofar as the smaller countries are concerned. I want to finish, Mr. Chairman. I'm a bit concerned about the drop-off in the Irish civil service involvement in Brussels. I think that's something that we should directly address. I think that should be addressed in the educational system and through the diplomatic services here. I think it should be done as a matter of urgency, and I think we need to educate people for those positions in Brussels and in all organisations that we Europeans converge on for whatever reason. The point I think that I would close with would be this. I think that Europe is going through a hiatus at the moment. I said there are questions. I see questions being raised in a number of member states, questions which we would regard as unreasonable questions, because all these alternatives put forward have been tried before, and they all failed. What is it with people sometimes that you have to go back again and have the same debate, very often in very trying circumstances, despite the fact that there is strong evidence there to show that they failed before? You know, we can go back centuries and find the same thing, but Europe has its own heritage in that particular area. We don't have to go back beyond the 20th century to find out all the things that we could do wrong and the depths to which we could go in order to inflict the maximum punishment on each other with death and destruction in all directions. And for any generation, and particularly the present generation of politicians, from whichever side they come, to forget that is a sad, sad reflection on what society has done. So I would say, I want to thank you, Catherine, for the work that you have done and continue to do in that particular area, and for particularly flagging for us the things that were happening before they actually happened. Because I believe greatly in the maxim, Mr. Chairman, that to be able to avert a crisis before it becomes recognised as a crisis is a greater art than trying to deal with it when the place is in flames. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Deputy Seán Haughey, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to thank Catherine for her comprehensive presentation and for setting out a number of practical suggestions on how we can do things and improve things generally from an Irish point of view. I recall you speaking once at the AGM of the European Movement Ireland, and it was at the height of the Brexit crisis, which we're still in, and you expressed concerns about Ireland taking her eye off the ball in relation to a number of other developments taking place in Europe, you know, the future of Europe, the multi-annual financial framework and migration and so forth. Do you still hold those concerns? Obviously you've set out the agenda, but do you think that Brexit has just completely taken over our public administration system, and you know, do you hold concerns about all these other developments which are proceeding? President Macron has set out his vision for Europe. I think he is to be thanked for that. Obviously, we don't agree with everything that he has said, and he is to be congratulated for producing a thought-provoking vision in relation to the future of Europe. It would seem to me that you know, states can be divided into three categories. nation states who don't want to make any more changes, pull up the ladder, what we have we hold. Then there are other nation states who believe in incremental change and on a pragmatic basis in the interests of citizens. I suggest Ireland is in that camp. And then there's a third category who do believe in deeper integration of the European Union. I'm not sure that Irish people are fully convinced about the need for deeper integration. We've seen that in our referendums. And I think any case for deeper integration will have to be clearly put before the Irish people and explained, and the rationale for it. And there'd have to be a lot of public debate. But how do you see the movement across the nation states? Is there an inexorable move towards deeper integration, or do you think that is going to be stalled and President Macron's vision will have difficulty being realised? Obviously, the UK leaving the European Union is a big challenge for us, for all sorts of reasons. The UK was an ally on all sorts of issues, and alliances now will have to be formed again in relation to all sorts of issues, including farm support or tax or security and defence or social policies and so on. So I know you've set out there some guidelines on that. How are we doing in relation to the challenge of the UK leaving and formulating new alliances? Are we engaged in that process? I know, as I said earlier on, our public administration system is convulsed by the fallout from Brexit, but do you think we're doing well in forging new alliances, or is there much work needs to be done there? And I agree with the other two previous speakers. I think the big alliance will be in relation to an alliance against populism, and we know where we stand in that regard. Just one final question. It's an innocent question in one way. We have a view that the Irish people are very popular and that everybody loves us and that we punch above our weight. and that we punch above our weight. Very much. Well, I know we have very good interpersonal skills, which I think you made reference to in your presentation, and our diplomatic skills and our public servants are excellent in respect of diplomacy and so on. But how are we considered generally in Europe, in the European Commission, and maybe across nation states? You have a lot of experience. We were a bold child in 2008 when our banks collapsed and we needed a bailout. And we're certainly causing a lot of problems at the moment in relation to the border and so forth. I suppose it's a light-hearted question. How are we viewed generally in the European Union?
Thank you very much, Deputy Haughey. And just before I make a few comments myself, I want to explain that Senator Crockwell, Senator Paul Coughlin and Senator Frank O'Rourke were here, but they had to leave. And it's no disrespect, it's just the Shannon was starting and they had to go to that. Before I make a few comments, I just want to welcome people like Noel O'Connell, the Director of the European Movement of Ireland, and we have ambassadors, we have a lot of people in the public gallery, but I also want to pay a very particular welcome to another very important group of people, in my humble opinion, and that is a group we have from the Greater Beaufort area, which is just outside of Cullinane, which of course everybody knows is the tourism capital of the world and the finest place in the nation that anybody could be from. So I just want to acknowledge that and put that on the record. Now, to thank you again for being here, Ms. Day, and you discussed your view that the Oireachtas has a further role to play in alliance building. Are there any ways that you feel that this committee could contribute to this? The committee regularly meets with stakeholders. For instance, I myself, on Tuesday mornings for a long period of time now, I meet with ambassadors from all over Europe and other officials, and I relay the contents of those meetings then to the members of this committee. I really believe that building alliances such as that, friendships, relationships, that's what politics is all about. As we discussed before the meeting started, I believe if our neighbours across the water were as good at talking at length as we are, I think they mightn't find themselves in the present mess that they are finding themselves in. But we have to try and mind our backs now because of what is happening over there. So do you have any other advice for us with regard to that? I mean, we deal with visiting parliamentary delegations Is there any other ways we could further use our platform to build alliances with other member states and also with our own citizens, and to try and create a positivity about Europe? Because, as you know yourself, there seems to be this attitude around Europe, indeed, when something goes wrong, oh, well, it's those politicians in Europe. You know that yourself because of the very important positions that you hold at present and that you held in the past. This negativity around it, and can we turn that around, especially in light of seeing what our neighbours across the water have done by putting themselves in the backed-in corner that they find themselves in now? And can we use that in some way to shore ourselves up? You know, like the EU26 have expressed strong support for Ireland and our position in the Brexit negotiations, often demonstrating a deep understanding of Ireland. Do you think that there are opportunities to build upon this wave of support, and that the EU's 26 deepened knowledge of Ireland and our challenges? And can we build on that? Much of the work on alliance building has been focused on government level and established diplomatic channels. We are interested in expanding this and looking at this, at the role of parliamentarians and the way that they can play an important role in alliance building. The Joint Committee here participates in COSAC and other parliamentary meetings, which are available for networking with parliamentarians from other member states and the European countries. And as I've said, we meet stakeholders, visiting delegations. We bring them in here. The members are very proactive and very workmanlike in their job, and we find that very good. So are there ways that you could recommend we further develop our already existing interparliamentary networks? Do you think that there is a risk that focusing on alliances between individual member states could contribute to perceived divisions within the EU, such as geographical divisions or established member states and newer member states? Or do you think this is an opportunity to move away from those type of situations? Alliances start with understanding. Are there any particular member states that you believe we in Ireland could try to understand more? In other words, do you see us falling down in our role in any of this? Most of us think that alliances as being between countries, but we are also interested in how better understandings and cooperations can be better developed between other stakeholders, maybe like trade unions, farming organisations, various interest groups. Do you think that these organisations, working with their European peers, can contribute to improved knowledge? I mean, I know myself, as do my colleagues here in this committee, all politicians, whether they're county councillors, senators or TDs or ministers, they know the valuable contribution, for instance, that the likes of the IFA, the ICMSA, all our people working in the tourism sectors, the Irish Hotels Federation, all of the different groups, the expertise that they have built up over years and years of work, of traipsing up and down the country, going to meetings, listening to the people involved. And when I say the people involved, who am I talking about? I'm talking about people who make a living from farming. I'm talking about people who make a living from tourism. Listening to those people, listening to the problems that they have, the issues of concern that they have. Can we more use those organisations than we are at present? And again, we're having local and European elections in May. One vision that I would have for our MEPs, and everybody knows in this room, I have no agenda whatsoever in promoting or not promoting political parties. I don't care where a person is coming from. Once they're good workers, that's all I'm interested. They can have Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil or Independent or Sinn Féin. If they're workers, I'm behind them, and I don't care where they're coming from. And if they're not workers, it doesn't matter what stamp they have in their back, they're no good in my book. Do you know, it's either you're a worker or you're not. But can we use our MEPs more than what we are at present? Because I see a lack of connectivity between our MEPs, and it's no disrespect to them as individuals. I don't mean anything disparaging against them themselves. But people, citizens who go out and vote and who don't vote, they think of MEPs as being people who are way over there in Europe and they've really nothing to do with us. But they really do have an awful lot to do with us. And you, more than any one of us inside in this room, maybe knows that because of your work history, which is, like I said at the beginning, extremely impressive. So is there something that we can do that can create a greater engagement, not just with us and our MEPs, but between the citizens, who are the people, they're the bosses, they're the people who we're there to represent in whatever role we're elected. And I'd love to see after the May, and because of the whole Brexit situation, that we'd have re-elected or new MEPs or whatever the case may be, but that there would be greater engagement at a ground level, and that people would be able to see something from their politicians in Europe. And it's just to put that out there with you. And Deputy McGrath, do you want to make a contribution? You're always welcome. You're okay. So could you just give a sort of a brief overview? I know we've hit you with a lot of different issues, but you take your time, and whatever way you can answer us, we appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. It's, you've raised a huge array of very interesting points, so I'll try to deal with at least some of them. I think on the question of how do we push back against the tide of populism, how do we try to maintain a feeling across the European population that Europe is a plus, that it doesn't take anything away from us nationally, but that it gives us extras. I don't really think that battle can be fought and won by the Brussels machinery alone. I think what is missing is the national voices in support of what's going on. And I think it's very important to try to distinguish between the overall architecture and the individual decisions that we don't like. And I think, especially in modern society, we have a tendency to conflate the two and to say, oh, the EU is useless or no good because of one thing we don't like. What I saw during the Euro crisis, where because of my role I was in the meetings with the heads of state and government and watching them go through sometimes 24 hours of wrestling with the problems, was that it left me with a strong conviction that in the end all of them, with the exception of the UK, wants the EU to succeed, and that they will take the hard decisions when they absolutely have to, because no matter how differently they approach things, they all know that all of our European countries are small in the modern world, and that we have no hope of influencing the wider world if we don't act as a grouping. And they all want a different kind of EU, but they want the EU to succeed. So I think that's a good starting point. I think that in some ways we are still digesting the 2004 enlargement, in a way, each of those countries that joined felt they would be then the 16th member state, and the rest of the EU felt, well, they're joining us, but we'll go on as before. And what we're still working out now is how a much bigger EU with different traditions and different expectations has to find its way. And I think we will. I think we're going through quite a challenge to our values at the moment, coming from old member states and new member states. So it's not unique to geography. But my sense of conviction, having seen them in very dire times, was that they all have a reason for wanting it to survive. And if you look at Greece, which is still going through a very difficult time, they haven't wanted to leave the euro or leave the EU because they understand that their future would be even more difficult without all that brings. So the challenge, I think, is for national politicians in a way to talk about the EU in more positive terms, not to be starry-eyed and to say it's all wonderful, but to say, look, to give a more mature assessment really to people and say, look, it's not so easy. There's 27 others or 26 others or 10 others who have to be brought on board. But what is important for small countries is the fact that we are represented, that we are at the table, that we have a say, and that there are reasons why we agree to the things that we do. I find it very interesting that legally qualified majority voting is the norm now in all legislation. But the EU very rarely pushes things to a vote. It will take another 6 months, another year to bring the reluctant on board, to keep trying to find compromises, because you get more inclusivity, but also you get better implementation if everybody has signed up to whatever it is being decided. So it's only really in extremis, when everything has broken down and there's a need to take a decision, that issues are pushed to a vote. And I think that, I don't mean the voting process has to be explained on a daily basis, but there needs to be a sharing of the responsibility for taking decisions at EU level. One of the things that really, really frustrated me in my time as Secretary-General was seeing the European Council spend all night drafting their conclusions and then coming out and 28 Prime Ministers giving different press conferences on what had just happened, instead of spending 24 hours drafting the conclusions and then saying, this is what we've agreed and we don't need to put a national spin on it. So I think there has been a wrong direction of at least quite a number of national politicians of all different parties feeling somehow that they had to come out from these meetings and say something different, or say how they had fought for a national point of view, instead of saying that we are a collective and we have collectively come to this conclusion, which we think will be good for all of us because everybody has had their fingerprint in the pie. So that's one thing I think. That's not to say Brussels can't do a better job. I think it can. And I think there's a lot it can do to improve the situation. But if it's always an outside voice trying to argue the merits of the EU, then I think it's lost in advance. It has to be the members. It's like any club. The members have to want it to succeed. And my conviction is that they do, but we will still have a lot of debate over quite a long time to come to hammer out where is it we want to go next. And some of that will not be comfortable for Ireland, because we will not have the same harmony of views as we have had with the UK on a lot of things, not on everything, but with a lot of things. I think the trade situation is something that needs careful attention. I think you're absolutely right to say we're coming to a stage now where some people believe might is right and that the biggest can call the shots. That is a kind of denial of the multilateral world that we have benefited from a lot in the last 70 years. But I think it's an area where Europe has to hold to its views and try to bring a lot of other countries in the world who think like us together. And I think the recent EU-Japan trade deal is a very good example of other big trading blocs in the world who believe in the rule of law, who believe in negotiated agreements, who believe in the mutual interests that can be negotiated there. And I think we have to find those alliances and build with them. But we do also, and this is why I raised the point about social policy, I do think that's an area where the EU has been behind, not only but largely because of steady British opposition to developing social policies. And I think there has to be a better way of those who gain from globalisation and from open trade sharing the benefits more with those who inevitably will lose or feel penalised by it. And I think that's a big challenge for Europe in the years to come. If we don't get that right, we will retreat in the face of pressure from the States and China, etc. We will also retreat into a less open way of doing business, and that will not be good for the smaller countries who make their living from it. I do worry about the numbers of new Irish officials in the institutions. I know the competitions are difficult, but I do think there are a lot of young Irish people, as you said, Senator Richmond, working in Brussels in consultancy companies and advocacy organisations, etc., who would love to work for the institutions. But I have to say, I don't think asking for a language derogation is the right way to do it. The British have argued for that for years, but it goes down extremely badly with the other countries, a lot of whom have to learn more than one other language in order to be able to work in a multilingual environment. But that's where I do think some help could be given, and there are examples of helping people who are going through the concours process to improve their language skills. I think that would not cost very much and would be a better way, because I think it's very important to show that you've made an effort to learn another language in order to understand and reach out to a different culture. That's the kind of thing that counts very much in the rest of the European Union. So I think we do need to be alive to encouraging younger people and helping them to go through the machinery. How are we doing on new alliances? I think, as I said, a lot of the smaller countries are going through the same thinking process as us. How can we group together to be more effective? I think there would be, I think there is a welcome for Ireland in many of these groupings. But I think we are going to have to do more to understand their problems and their positions, and maybe give them more support in areas where we wouldn't have been interested in the past. I've always told the story about one of my Luxembourg colleagues who was a specialist in the common fisheries policy, even though Luxembourg has no sea. And when you'd ask him, why do you bother? He'd say, because it's important to my other colleagues and I want to be able to brief my ministers and tell them how we think it should go, but also how to help them. So I think it's going to require more effort on our part. And there are, I mean, we tend to be very pragmatic. And there's a much more visionary dimension to a lot of how other countries see the EU. And we maybe have to get a bit more lyrical or a bit more in understanding of the less pragmatic side of things. So I think we are always viewed as being well prepared. I think we would be welcome. But I do think that we and the other small member states are going to have to work harder together to replace the expertise that the UK brought to a lot of sectoral fora. They were always very well, their analysis was always well prepared. They had always thought ahead to the consequences. They played an important role in questioning and improving proposals. And we're all going to miss that expertise. So I think there are alliances to be formed by sharing that work out in the future among not always the smaller member states, but certainly with the smaller member states. And I think the role of visits is very important. If we think about the number of different national parliaments that have come here and gone to the border, so they wanted to go and see for themselves, and having seen for themselves, I think they became important allies then in the overall building of support for Ireland. So I think we could selectively do a bit more of that, going to visit places or attend meetings that are important to other member states. And I think that really builds a well of goodwill, but also of understanding that we would need in the future. So I want to say something about the dangers of over-specialisation on sectors. I think it's natural that, say, the people who know most about digital or agriculture or whatever will club together, and I think that's very important, and that sharing of experience is very important. But I think it's important also that somebody has an overview, and for example this committee is obviously one place that has the overview, because when things don't get sorted out and when they start to go up the political agenda of the European Union, then there's a kind of a hierarchy that takes place, and there's only political space to deal with a certain number of issues. And it's very important in every system that we have an accurate readout of the relative weight of different things. I'm thinking of the debates to come on the future budget of the EU, which will have to be decided fairly quickly once the new Parliament and new Commission are in place. Every country will have their own set of priorities, but somehow in each country there needs to be somebody who is watching the gradual filtering down of the issues to the top 3 or 4 that will be decided by the European Council. So so in sectors, yes, very important, but also having the overview and keeping a national track of that, I think, is also very important. The risk of geographic divisions, I think, is there, but I think if we have kind of visiting rights to all the different groups and we make an effort to go and participate from time to time, I think we could be perceived as a very welcome individual, because we don't have the big country agenda. We won't always be pushing a particular line. we will be there wanting to make the thing work. We will have our views, but wanting to make it work. So I think we as a country could avoid falling into the trap of only being seen as part of one particular group. I think the idea of Brexit eclipsing all other issues for the moment, I think that inevitably there is some truth in that. I mean, for us as a country, it's such a huge issue, and especially the risk of no deal is something that has demanded an enormous amount of energy and is clearly the top priority. But at some stage, the need for that will lessen, hopefully in more positive rather than less positive circumstances. And then I think we will have to come back to the big issues on the European agenda, obviously the future budget, but also the issue of migration, where I think we have to find a European policy, and all the other issues that one could mention. So I think that's why it's important that there has been this dialogue on the EU post-Brexit. It's hard to get people to really concentrate on it, but at least the topic is there, and across government and in a lot of stakeholder organisations, work is being done that can be ramped up when there's a bit more political space and time for it, because I think it's very important. How can we address negativity? I think, again, we do need to do more to debunk the myths, but that's not so easy. And as I say, I think the UK media in particular have developed ridicule into a fine art, and it is the most damaging thing. And if you see the way Nigel Farage always gets a laugh in the European Parliament, even from people who don't agree with him, it is devastating. So we have to, I think, work harder to try to explain. And probably the way to do it, I would think one way to do it is to bring the stakeholders more in. I'm very struck when you talk to individual representative groups, no matter who and what they represent. Their knowledge of their sector across Europe is usually quite high because they're all linked into other European networks. But then they're very quite narrow in their specialisation. And I think what we need to graft onto that degree of specialisation is, as I say, this overview of where the European Union as a whole is going. And sometimes maybe we need to bring it back to the simpler areas of why does it matter that it works. I think when we all go outside the EU, we feel very European because we look back in and then we see what it is that makes us different from the rest of the world. So we've got to try and channel that and say to people, you know, Europe does stand, and does stand for certain values that we have benefited from and that we hold very dear. And I think part of the debate that's going on at the moment is a battle for the place of values and what are the fundamental values that are the rock bottom of the European Union and that everybody needs to adhere to. So I think for all those reasons, we are going to have to invest more time and more energy in future in reaching out to the others to understand that they come from a different vantage point. I think with our history and our geography, we don't feel the same security pressures as some of the others do. And so we tend to be less open to that argument for wanting the EU to succeed. But if you look at like the Baltic states, they joined the euro not only for economic reasons, but also because they understood it's the core of the EU and they want for security reasons to be in the core. Now, we need to find ways to engage with that, even though it's not our primary concern, it's quite low on our list of priorities. So this is the kind of thing I suggest. And I think maybe for parliamentarians, it would be useful to reach out to groups of countries rather than try to cover everybody at the same time, but to, you know, over a certain time cycle, target different groups. So in addition to the COSAC meetings, then to see smaller groups of parliamentarians from the point of view sometimes of just listening, but also then of having them listen to us and seeing where alliances can be made. And there's a lot of useful work going on in different countries about how to involve citizens. And some of this has been documented now. And there were very innovative ways about trying to bring this huge process to a level of relevance with different citizens. And as I said, I think we have experimented in this country with some forms of citizen involvement that show that people are willing to take the time if the expertise and the time is given to them to help them formulate their ideas and think through. And if we have that, I think we can try to overcome the alienation of parts of our society across Europe and try to develop a new understanding of what's the value of the European Union for the coming 20 or 30 years, because each generation has to make its own definition of what's the EU. I sympathise, I think it was with you, Deputy Durkan, who said about why do we have to keep going through the same battles all the time. But unfortunately we do, because there's a new generation coming all the time, new generation of public representatives, new generations of lobbyists, etc. And they will always try their hand at saying, oh, but that's old hat, let's debunk that, because there are so many interests at stake. But I think we have to not only repeat and explain why, but also be open to change where it's good, but not necessarily to change the principles if we have tried and tested them and they are solid, but to bring people around to understanding why certain things are as they are. But I understand the fatigue that's there of having to constantly repeat the battles. And I think that's what, again, one thing that we need to explain better to our citizens everywhere, I think, is just how much of the EU is built on compromise. In some parts of the world, compromise is seen as a weakness, as a dirty word almost, whereas I think in Europe we see it as a strength. It's about understanding the other point of view and finding an accommodation. And we all know that in our own lives. So we need to bring that home to people and explain that it isn't all black and white. It's about finding that ground in between, that maybe you don't get everything you want, but you get enough of what you want and you can bring the other person with you. And I think that subtlety, if you like, has been lost in the very polarised world in which we are at the moment. So I know I haven't covered every point everybody made, but perhaps I could pause there.
Overview, yeah. But could I just say, I think that we have everything covered, and we want to appreciate very much again your time for coming here today. We're going to suspend to allow time to change over, but before we go, could we maybe perhaps take a photo here? Yes, we'll suspend and we'll do a photo, and then we're coming back into private session.